So thanks for coming out. We have a nice crowd here tonight, even in light of no power. We are very fortunate this evening to have the executive director of the Lake George Association with us.
Thank you, George. And it's great to be here in Hewlett's. I'm very happy to be here tonight. I know that you'd like to hear about what we have going on Lake George. I was given a couple of ideas of things that I should talk about. One was sort of an update on the whole Gaslight Village Westbrook project that we've been working on the south end of Lake George for many, many years. That project actually dates back in its original thoughts about 20 years. But we purchased, along with 2 other environmental groups and 3 municipalities, we purchased the property that used to be Gaslight Village. Many of you remember Gaslight Village, right? That was the place to go back in the day. Yes. Mm-hmm. The whole parcel, essentially at the head of the lake, was owned by the Charles R. Wood Foundation. Charlie Wood founded Gaslight Village and Storytown and many other amusement parks around the area. And we were able to purchase what was left of Gaslight Village and the property around it, and convert part of it, for our interests, convert part of it into a project that protects Lake George. We know that Lake George Village is very heavily developed, lots of paved areas, lots of impervious surface, as we call it in the stormwater world, where there's runoff that comes down the road, comes down the parking lots, collects pollution, collects nutrients, collects sediment, sweeps it all into the lake. It was all going into Westbrook, which is one of the major tributaries to Lake George, and right out into the lake, forming a huge delta, huge milfoil beds, because they just loved all those nutrients coming down. So what we were able to do is treat about 90 acres of impervious surface by installing what's called a stormwater wetland. So this wetland area, on the south parcel of the property, you can see here's Westbrook. It runs straight through the middle of the property. On the north was where Gaslight Village was. On the south was Charlie's Saloon and I think some other amusement park activities. Waxlight Village was there for a while. Wow, look at that. You have to bring your own light to Hewlett's, though. That's the only thing I know. So what we were able to do, instead of all that stormwater going directly into Westbrook and out into Lake George, it now is diverted underground to this little area down here, where it first hits the sediment retention pond, slows down the speed of the water, the sediment falls out, and because it's close enough to the road, we can actually get a truck in there and a backhoe and scoop out that sediment every couple of years. So that sediment then falls out there. The water continues on through the series of wetlands, way back to here, and as it's going through there, slowly, it's either absorbing into the soil or the nutrients are being removed by the plants in the wetland. That's a natural function of a wetland, is to suck up the nutrients out of the ground, out of the water, and they use the nutrients in their growth, but those nutrients are then removed from the water column, and by the time it gets out here, lost the light, no problem. It's then treated through what's called a gravel wetland as a finishing treatment, so the roots of the plants now go down into the gravel, and the water flows through the gravel, and the roots pull up the nutrients, and then out into Lake George as clean water. The engineers designed it for certain types of storms. We've been getting bigger storms. So what we did experience this year is that this first pond, and we had a storm where we had 2 inches of rain in about 20 minutes. And it overtopped and it flowed back across the road a little bit. So what we're doing is we're coming back in here this fall and increasing the size of the berm that's around this side of the pond so that it will retain a greater volume of water. So it was designed one way. In fact, it needed to be designed a little bit better to have a little bit more capacity. We're going to make that happen this year. So these things they're not exact. They're sort of a work in progress, and what we've discovered, we're learning from our miscalculation in that case, and we're going to sort of berm it up a little bit more and improve the way that functions. Now the rest of the project, and for the municipal involvement, they got this wonderful park out of this. But it's all environmentally friendly. This beautiful big lawn that they have is all native turf, and it's porous, it's a porous type of turf that's built up and it does not get compacted when they drive vehicles on it and so forth. It has like this grid work underneath all the turf. So it'll absorb the water, the rainfall, it won't pond up, yet they can still have their festivals and activity on it. So they get this wonderful space for that. We have a children's natural playground that goes behind and around the entire park. So there's like logs for them to climb on, canoes that will be sort of in the ground for them to play in, climbing walls, and all sorts of fun activity for kids, that all in a natural landscape. So it's going to be a great addition to the Lake George area, to the Lake George community, and for our purposes as an environmental organization, it's protecting Lake George by treating all this stormwater down here. So I know everyone wants to hear about how the boat inspection program is going on Lake George. The Lake George Association, a few years back, 8 years back, ran a program on Lake George called the Lake Stewards Program. It was a voluntary program. Boaters would come to Lake George. We would offer them information about invasive species, how invasive species are transported and so forth, tell them how bad they are for lakes, and say, would you mind if we have a look at your boat? Can we inspect your boat? And almost everybody complied with that, but it was a voluntary program. We inspected boats, we pulled a lot of milfoil off boats, we pulled a lot of zebra mussels off, and many other harmful things that were coming to Lake George. The program collected data about where these boats were coming from, other lakes that were coming, that were sending boats to Lake George and potentially sending invasive species to Lake George. So we had years worth of data on this, and that data helped support the argument for going one step further into a mandatory inspection program. So last year, the Lake George Park Commission was able to put into place a mandatory boat inspection program in Lake George. It's not the voluntary program that the LGA ran, it's now the law. You have to have your boat inspected, and if necessary, decontaminated by a hot water, high pressure wash station before it enters Lake George, because we don't want any more invasives coming into the lake. We're having trouble dealing with the ones that we have, and I'll talk about some of those in a moment. So through the efforts of the local municipalities, the Lake George Association, the Fund for Lake George, the Lake George Park Commission, we were all able to pull together and make sure that this program happens. And now we are in its second year, and it's a very successful program by all accounts. We've had no resistance to it. At first, many people were saying it's going to be long lines at all the boat launches, and we don't want any additional fees to come to Lake George. Well, we made it free. There are no fees involved. It's just part of normal business of coming to Lake George now. And there's been no resistance to it. Everybody's found it very successful. So far this year, they've inspected 12,582 boats, all the different stations around here. Now, you have one here at Hewlett's Marina. That's not one of the busiest. I can honestly tell you, that's not one of the busiest. It's a crucial one, but Mossy Point up in Ticonderoga, Norwal down over in Bolton Landing, those are really busy inspection stations. So with all the inspection stations, 12,500 boats have been inspected, 698 have been decontaminated. So that means those boats were deemed to either not be clean, not be drained completely, or not be dry. And dry doesn't mean that you had a rainstorm on your way up the Northway. Dry means your bilge has, not being dry means your bilge has water in it from somewhere else, or your ballast tanks have water from somewhere else. So those need to be flushed with this hot water, high pressure wash. And of the boats that have been inspected this year and decontaminated, 29 have actually had invasive species attached to them. So there's 29 saves. Last year, they had about 200 or so that they removed over the course of the year. Any one of those could have started a new infestation in Lake George. There's things out there on the horizon, hydrilla, that's over in the Finger Lakes. Quagga mussels not too far away. These are all horrible things that you would not want getting into Lake George. We already deal with invasive species. We have milfoil, we have zebra mussels, we have Asian clams. I've got some examples of those here. Milfoil, you've probably seen it in some patches around the lake. We're in the second year of a 3-year program working with the Lake George Park Commission and other nonprofits around the lake. The Park Commission's program is investing about $400,000 this year in an all-out hand harvesting for milfoil. They started last year. It's going to happen this year and next year, sort of a 3-year, all hands on deck, scuba divers, hand harvesting, collecting the milfoil, removing it from all these locations around the lake. There's about 200 places around the lake where milfoil currently exists in heavy amounts, and getting it out. And the success that we've seen in other lakes is that you come on with this really heavy effort at first, and then after that, you just have a maintenance effort after a while. So, we're collectively, we're going to be spending $1.5 million over the course of 3 years. But then the hope is that after that, the divers will do a sweep of the lake periodically and just remove some of these patches that might pop up. Sort of maintenance as opposed to full-scale management. Well, it's hard to say what would have happened, but I'm pretty confident in that if milfoil was gotten under control by some method, whether it be that chemical method or other methods, if it was hit harder sooner, we wouldn't have this problem as widespread in Lake George. Now, as far as revisiting the idea of chemical solutions, we've been discussing it. Now, we're not at any point where we're ready to put a permit application out there or anything like that. That was put down very distinctly when the issue was on the table several years back. It was probably 12 years ago now that I think that was pretty much put to rest by the Adirondack Park Agency. But they did permit an application in Luzerne, and they did permit an application somewhere else in the Adirondacks. So with the right conditions, there's still the possibility of going back for some new chemical application. There are other chemicals that are used out there as well. An example is the Hague boat launch. If you're familiar at all with the town of Hague and their little public park and their public boat launch, it's a very enclosed area. They've got a lot of milfoil in there, and every time a boat goes through, it fragments it, and that starts to grow somewhere else. That's something that you can cordon off very nicely, do an application there, and then and really be done with it in that area for quite a few years. I think now that people have come to terms with the cost of management, they are willing to look at other solutions. Yeah. And now that we have this mandatory inspection program, and it's less likely that a new invasive is going to come in. See, if you did a chemical application or you went, and did a very expensive management effort, but you still had your gates wide open and all these invasives are still coming in, that's a hard argument to make. Is it cost effective to do that? But now that we have a lot more control, a lot better protection for the lake, it's worth looking at these other solutions. Hydrilla would be much worse than milfoil by times 100. It grows very quickly, grows very thick. You would not be able to boat through an area where there's hydrilla. They have it in Cayuga Inlet right now, and it's growing fast, and it's going to be very expensive for them to manage it. And it doesn't just fragment, it doesn't just spread by root growth, it also sends out these little seeds, and it also sends out these like other blossoms. It grows and spreads in so many different ways. These are invasive species. They're called invasives because they very, very effectively invade and take over a whole area. So it's scary. It's scary what's out there. So we want to keep those things from getting into Lake George. So the statistic on milfoil so far this year is, let's see, where is it? So far this year we have removed, and when I say we, this is the Park Commission's program, but we're investing in it, other groups are investing in it, so it's a collective group effort. It's a lot of collaboration on this, and we're working with the Commission on identifying sites and scheduling divers and so forth. But so it's a coordinated effort for the first time these last year and this year. 944 bags. So it's hard to say what size a bag is. It's about the size of a typical garbage bag, but it's a mesh bag. But that equates to 23,600 pounds or 11.8 tons of milfoil so far this year, and they're going to be in the water till September, well into September. Hand harvesting method is, what they usually do is they take this mesh bag, they put it around a plant, they remove the plant from the root, they put their hand right down into the sediment, pull the whole root ball out and the plant, keep it in the mesh bag, and then remove that to the surface. And they also pick any little particles that they've disturbed out of the water column and remove those as well. Milfoil, especially toward the middle of August, starts to fragment on its own even. So you rattle a plant, you touch a plant in the water and the fragments start to move and then they reroot. Very aggressive. Now, for about 10 years on Lake George, they were using benthic barriers or mats, vinyl mats, to deprive milfoil of light. And that kills it off pretty effectively at first. But the challenges with benthic barriers are, as the milfoil decomposes, gases are released, just from typical composition of plants, gases are released, so it bubbles up the mats, so they rise up under the water. That's one problem. So you have to cut slits in all the mats so that they can breathe and let some of the air out. The other problem is when they're left in too long, other sediment collects on top and you get this nice fluffy sediment that's very rich in nutrients, and milfoil loves to grow in that type of environment. So you end up getting new milfoil growing even faster on top of the mats. So that's why we're kind of shifting over to this hand harvesting method. You're actually removing the whole plant and getting it out of there. And the Park Commission does a really good job of enforcing and inspecting boats and registering boats that do have the capability of having that, but they have to inspect them to make sure that they cannot discharge into the lake. And just by the way, there was a time when it was almost going to be legal to discharge into Lake George. If you look back into the 70s, there was a big argument that it was going to be permitted to discharge into Lake George and other lakes, other inland water bodies, as long as you use something called a chlorinator macerator, which essentially ground it up and added some chlorine, and then they said it was safe to discharge. The LGA fought that, and we won years back. That's back in the 70s. Most of you know that the Lake George Association is the oldest lake association in the country, and we date back to 1885. So we were founded many, many years back, and I firmly believe that that's why Lake George is in the condition it's in today. I don't think anyone can argue with that. Now there are many groups working together to do that, to protect the lake, and we have regulatory agencies now. That's very helpful. But back in the day, it was just the LGA and its members, and being very vigilant and dedicated.
Well,
yes?
You have something you brought called a mystery snail.
Sure.
If you could pass it around and talk about what a mystery snail is.
Sure. There are several invasive species in Lake George. We've talked about milfoil. We've talked about zebra mussels a little bit. Zebra mussels right now are not really a big problem because we don't have enough calcium in our water to support their growth for their shells. So far, they're not widespread. There are several locations around the lake, but they're not like taking over like they have in many other lakes. Asian clams came in just a few years ago. We've done some management work putting the benthic barriers that we talked about for milfoil. Well, we put those on the Asian clams and smothered the Asian clams. That works very well. The problem is they reproduce very quickly too. So they're kind of like, we're chasing them around the lake right now. We've been fortunate with Asian clams over the past few years that the harsh winters that we've had have caused a great die-off rate for the Asian clams. So they might grow a lot in the summer, but then they die off 90% in the winter. So they're starting, with a 10% population, and they do, of course, grow and reproduce, like I said. But so far, our harsh winters have been helping. Around the time when Asian clam was first discovered, so that's about 5 years ago, I think, we also discovered, and this is LGA staff out looking for Asian clams, we discovered something called the Chinese mystery snail, which we did not know existed in Lake George. At the time we discovered it, it was not on the list of invasive species, so it wasn't really considered anything to deal with at that point. It was just remarkable that it had never been in Lake George before, never been noticed in Lake George before. But now, under New York State's new list of invasive species, Chinese mystery snail is on that list as an invasive, and we've now discovered it in a second location in Lake George. But they're easy to hand harvest, so if you see them, easily remove those. And they took about 100 out of the Rogers Rock boat launch area, Rogers Rock campsite boat launch area, and we're going to take out some more where we saw them in Boone Bay down toward the south end in Bolton. So I think that's not something that we're going to be too concerned about, but it does exist in Lake George. And then I also have examples here of the Asian clams and the zebra mussels. Well, honestly, for instance, with the Asian clams, we work with a task force of other groups. We all, when Asian clams were discovered, we pulled together folks, the scientists from Darien Freshwater Institute, the other nonprofits, the government agencies around the lake. We even brought in friends from the Lake Champlain Basin program. We are, in Lake George, part of the Lake Champlain Basin, so we qualify for some of the support that they get, some of the federal funding, and also some of the advice. So they brought along their rapid response folks, and we did the best we could to manage the early populations of Asian clams. So it's always a group effort. It's nobody just taking off and saying, we're going to do this on our own. It's always everybody pulling together and deciding as a group what to do. Lake Champlain has 50 invasive species. Yeah, and very high phosphorus levels, which, we're seeing increase in phosphorus in Lake George, but we're doing the best we can as a group, the LGA and other groups, to keep that phosphorus, keep the increase in phosphorus at bay as best we can. Vermont and Lake Champlain have a big challenge because they have so many agriculture fields, so many fields that are in current farming right now, producing a lot of phosphorus and getting into Lake Champlain. Fortunately, in Lake George, we don't have a lot of ag. We don't have a lot of developed area. We do have some concentrated developed area, but most of what you see is open space, and more than half of it is state land. Up until a couple of years ago, those lawns were probably fertilized with phosphorus fertilizer. Now in New York State, there's a ban on the use of phosphorus fertilizer. So you can't apply it to lawns in New York State. In all of New York State, right. Warren County did it on its own at first. They did a no phosphorus law. But then the next year or 2 years later, New York State did a statewide ban on phosphorus fertilizer. Also banning it in dishwashing detergent and laundry detergent and some other things that weren't already banned. Some of those things had been banned since the 80s.
Have they been brought in from Vermont?
People might still bring it in from Vermont. It's not legal. The enforcement has yet to be proven, the enforcement of that law, but it is illegal for the applicators to put it down, the homeowners to put it down, so there's no reason to have phosphorus getting into the lake anymore from lawns. Weed killers and things like that, they have to use those based on the guidelines that are federally mandated. So there shouldn't be any weed killers and things like that getting too close to the lake anyway. Now, of course, everything flows downhill. So if you're applying it near a stream or a ditch, yeah. So those things, maybe through education, we can keep people from doing that. Yes.
What about the salt?
Salt is a big issue in Lake George. Salt levels, based on information that we have from Darien Freshwater Institute's 30 years of scientific data collection on Lake George and chemical sampling, salt levels have increased three times in Lake George over the past 30 years. So salt levels are reaching a point where they will start being not hazardous. They will start being a problem for drinking as a drinking water supply. They're not at that level yet, but if trends continue, they will get there. What we're doing is we're working with the municipalities, the highway departments around the lakes, New York State Department of Transportation, to change the way they apply salt to the roads. There's an expectation that the roads are clean in the winter. You guys could not get over this hill. And I've done it a few times in the winter when we've inspected some sites and I've gotten stuck on the wrong side of the hill in the snowstorm. It's a challenge. You wouldn't want to not have a clean road there. So there's an expectation from drivers that the roads are all cleaned right down to bare pavement. Salt is the best method for doing that, but there are ways of applying that salt, pre-treating the road with a brine solution that are more effective and use less salt in the long run. That's going to be helpful to the municipalities. They won't have to spend as much money on their salt supply. We've held two symposiums, two conferences with highway superintendents all around the basin and elsewhere, where we've had guest speakers come in from departments of transportation in other states, and they shared with us their successes. A lot of this is education. The guys from the highway department that are out there in the field on those cold winter nights, they're using equipment that's 20, 30 years old. They're using methods that they learned about years ago, there are new ways of doing things. So we're trying to educate people on how to better apply the salt, better apply, and even try alternate materials. There are things called magic salt and clear lane. Some of them are salt byproducts or different ways of pre-treating, where you pre-treat the salt with a compound that makes it stick to the road better as opposed to bouncing off into the ditches. There's lots of education and lots of new methods that can be utilized, and we're working with the different municipalities. Now, what we found is well-maintained pavement is a lot easier to keep clear in the winter. And I have to applaud your town of Dresden here for all the work. I don't know how much of a disruption it was for everybody here in Hewlett's, but your roads are beautifully surfaced. I don't know if it was a big, pardon me? Well, I know, and I live in the North Country, I know, but I'll tell you, go on the other side, go down Route 9N over Tongue Mountain right now, and the place is riddled with potholes like Swiss cheese. It's awful, and that's harder to maintain in the winter because you can't scrape that clear. So I don't know how it's going to happen, but that road needs to be resurfaced so that it can be more easily maintained. That plow blade has to scrape close to the road surface to get that clear, clean area. We're in the process of going from highway department to highway department, and we've asked the various highway departments, what equipment do you have now? What do you need to do your job better? And we've come up with a sort of a first pass at a wish list, and we're submitting a grant request to New York State to fund upgraded equipment for all the highway departments around the lake. I don't know how successful it'll be, but it's something that's a high priority. We can't let that salt level keep rising at that rate. We work very well with the other nonprofits around Lake George, the Lake George Land Conservancy, the Fund for Lake George. They are younger organizations, they are newer organizations. Some of them grew out of other organizations. The LGA and the fund were together at one point. We were one organization. They were the fundraising arm of the LGA when we were doing more lobbying under a different tax code, an older tax code that the LGA couldn't do as much advocacy if we were also raising money. So we worked together on many projects. This Westbrook project was a group effort between the LGA, the Land Conservancy, the Fund for Lake George, and Warren County, Town of Lake George, Village of Lake George. So that, some of these things are so big you have to all get together to make them happen. There's some things we do individually though. So what we try to do is coordinate as best we can with the type of projects that are out there. We're coordinating on the milfoil removal. We're coordinating on the Asian clam work and working together on those. Sometimes we're pooling funds to make these things happen because some of these are very expensive projects. But we're individual organizations now with separate boards of directors and similar missions, but not exactly the same mission. Because we're all here to protect Lake George. We're here to protect the water quality. We're here to protect the entire watershed. The Lake George Association has been doing it longer. We have a very broad education program. We have a very broad selection of projects that we undertake. Our stormwater projects are very practical, sort of in-the-ground projects where we actually are installing stormwater basins under roadways or installing rain gardens in public parks. They're very hands-on projects. So I would say that that's one of the distinctions. The other organizations would probably appreciate being able to define their own mission to you. So I think that would be a good question to bring up maybe with the other organizations individually. We do not purchase property. In fact, even in this Westbrook project, we didn't purchase the actual property. We purchased the conservation easement over the property so that we could do with it what we needed to for the stormwater. We have a resource guide, I think it's on the outside table now, that talks about lake-friendly living and how you can do things at your home to improve Lake George water quality one way or another. Installing rain barrels to keep your downspouts from draining down through a channel and washing sediment into the lake. Rain gardens with native plants. Lots of good tips in there for living more lake-friendly. Even the small things that we do as individuals and homeowners around the lake have a cumulative positive impact on the lake. I would say, particularly here in Hewlett's, your sewer collection system is very helpful. For those of you who are on that system, very helpful to have that. Those of you who have individual septic systems, make sure they're inspected well-maintained, not failing, pumped out on a regular basis. So if you're doing things with household chemicals and they're going into your septic system and they're going into the ground, it's engineered to absorb those chemicals and not have those things go into the lake as long as it's used, as long as it's functioning properly. If it's not functioning properly and there's a breach in it and it's going out into a ditch or going out across your lawn or something like that, then that's something that should be fixed. Yeah.
Any final questions?
I just want to open up to everyone here. What do you see as important issues around Lake George that the LGA might want to tackle, might want to get on board, might want to take a leadership role in? What do you think Lake George needs to help keep it clean? From your observations living here as residents, boating on the lake, out and about in your neighborhood, give me some feedback. Give Pat and me some feedback about what you think needs to be improved around the lake. Lake George has a long retention time. It has a roughly 7 to 8 year retention time. So water that enters the lake is in the lake for a long period of time. So it takes a while to see an improvement. It also takes a while to see a problem, which is challenging. So the salt problem didn't really start coming on to the radar until about 20 years ago when you started seeing that elevation. That's when most of the departments switched from sand exclusively to salt. And part of that was at the request of environmental groups like the LGA at the time, saying sand is forming deltas in Lake George. Sand is getting into the streams. Sand is a problem. Sediment is a problem. So everybody switched over to salt. Salt is a tried and true method of removing ice and snow. There's no question about that. But yes, there are other methods out there. There are other techniques for applying salt, but also other types of material that you can put down. Some of them have negative effects too. There's a coating that they put on some of the salt that is an organic material, but that's high in phosphorus. So you really have to look at all sides of these issues. Calcium chloride. Calcium chloride would not be a good alternative for us because, like I said, the calcium levels in Lake George are low enough not to support zebra mussels in most areas. If calcium levels rose, zebra mussels would be able to build their shells more efficiently, and they would start taking over. I think if we were able to get together with those county highway departments earlier in the process, like if you knew of a project coming up, but it wasn't finished being designed yet, we could probably have some influence and probably help guide them into doing it in a better way. And maybe even incentivize them with some other funding, because there are culvert replacement grants out there. There are fish passage grants out there that you put in a different type of culvert that's easier for fish to cross, and it's also more appropriately designed with stormwater issues in mind. So I think if we can get to the highway departments when they're doing a project before they're in the ground, that would be the better option. And we try to reach out with them, and sometimes we're able to. Down in Lake George Village, when Warren County was considering repaving Beach Road, a few of us got together with the county highway department and said, have you thought of a different pavement, a porous pavement, porous asphalt? And they hadn't thought of that. They were just going to resurface it. And we were able to show them examples of porous pavement that works, how well it works for stormwater runoff controls. They did a field trip to Maine to see some that was already in place in Maine. And in the end, it has porous pavement. We incentivized them with some funding to do the engineering so that they didn't have to pay for that extra engineering to bring it up to porous asphalt. They were willing to go here. We helped them come up to here. And now they've got porous asphalt, which is a great benefit.
Now, my thought is that if you guys could communicate.
Well, we try to. We try to. Sometimes we're able to get to them at the right time, and sometimes it doesn't work. So, we are working with the Lake George Park Commission. We are paying for half the cost of a new Lake George boater or Lake George recreation study. One was done 10 years ago, determined where there are lots of boats, where there's boat traffic, the size of the boats on the lake, how people are interacting with the lake, with swimming, fishing, kayaking, sailing, whatever. We're in the midst of that study, again, to update that one from 10 years ago. And part of it is to do a user survey of everyone around Lake George. So there is a link on our website and on the Park Commission's website to a user survey. It only takes you about 6 or 7 minutes to fill out. But it gives you a chance to tell them, the consultants, what your observations are about the lake and what you see as problems, issues, benefits, so that they can update that older survey now and make their decisions based on new data rather than 10-year-old data when they're doing dock permits and boat permits and all sorts of other things, marina permits.
If we could all give Walt a big round of applause. That's Pat, I put your box out here on the table. That's fine. That's great.